She wasn't the kind of woman men like Aldrich Soane noticed. That was the whole point. Vivienne Marsh had spent 3 years making herself invisible inside the walls of Soane Capital. Not because she lacked confidence exactly, but because she'd learned early that invisible was safer. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a clip that probably cost $2 at a shopper's drug mart. She wore cardigans in colors that didn't have names. Not top, not gray, something in between that said, "Please don't look at me," without actually saying anything at all. She arrived before anyone else and left after most of them. She ate lunch at her desk. She knew every line of every contract, every offshore account, every shell company that Soane Capital used to launder the Soane family's considerable interests through the legitimate economy. And she kept that knowledge tucked behind a pleasant, forgettable smile. She was the best accountant Aldrich had ever employed. He had told her this once, on her 2nd anniversary with the firm, in the same tone a man uses to compliment a particularly reliable espresso machine. She had thanked him and gone back to her spreadsheets. That was the arrangement. That was what made sense. What didn't make sense. What Aldrich Soane absolutely could not explain to himself. Standing outside Le Jardin on a Thursday evening in late October, with rain beginning to spot the shoulders of his coat, was the feeling that had taken hold of his chest approximately 45 seconds ago when he'd glanced through the restaurant's front window and seen Vivienne Marsh sitting across from a man he didn't recognize, laughing at something the man had said, her cardigan nowhere in evidence, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a burgundy dress that suggested she had been hiding a considerable amount of herself from the world, from him. The thought arrived without invitation and he didn't examine it. He just stood there in the rain. Boss. His driver, Finn, was leaning out the window of the SUV parked at the curb. "You getting out or what?" "I'm already out," Aldrich said, which was technically true and entirely unhelpful. He looked through the window again. The man across from Vivienne was saying something now, leaning forward slightly, and she was listening with her chin resting in her hand, and something about the angle of her head, attentive, warm, genuinely interested, made Aldrich's jaw tighten in a way he couldn't account for. He went inside. He hadn't meant to sit near her. The maitre had led him to a table toward the back, which was where he always sat. Clear sight lines, back to the wall, old habit, and it happened to be close enough that he could hear the conversation at Vivienne's table without trying. He was shown a menu he didn't look at. He ordered whatever the waiter suggested. He watched Vivienne Marsh have dinner with a man named, apparently, Jeffrey, and he felt something happening in his chest that he chose to describe to himself as professional concern. Jeffrey worked in municipal planning. He had a pleasant face and a laugh that came easily. He was explaining something about rezoning applications with genuine enthusiasm, and Vivienne was nodding along, and at some point she said something quiet that made Jeffrey throw his head back and laugh, and Aldrich found himself staring at the breadbasket with an intensity it did not deserve. She looked different. That was the thing he kept returning to. It wasn't simply the dress, though the dress was. He set that thought aside. It was something in the way she was sitting. Open, unguarded. Like a version of herself she kept stored somewhere he'd never been permitted to look. He'd had Vivienne Marsh sitting 6 feet from his office door for 3 years, and he had never once seen her look like that. The question, arriving quietly and then not so quietly, whose fault was that? He flagged down the waiter. "Send a bottle of the Pouilly Fumé to that table." He indicated with a small movement of his hand, the lady's favorite. The waiter blinked. "Sir, does the lady?" "She will," Aldrich said. He watched the bottle arrive, watched Vivienne's expression shift from surprise to recognition to something more complicated when her eyes lifted, and found him across the room. He raised his glass very slightly. She stared at him for a moment, and he'd worked with this woman for 3 years, and he had never, not once, seen her stare at him like that. Like she was recalculating. Jeffrey turned to see what she was looking at. Aldrich met the man's eyes pleasantly and did not smile. They came to his table, which was not what he'd planned, but was perhaps what he'd hoped for. In some part of himself he wasn't ready to examine. "Mr. Soane," Vivienne said, and her voice had that particular quality it got when she was being very careful.
"This is Jeffrey Ashworth."
"Jeffrey, this is my employer, Aldrich Soane." Jeffrey extended his hand. He had a good handshake, which Aldrich noted and resented slightly. "Big fan of the Soane Foundation," Jeffrey said, referring to the charitable arm Aldrich's PR team had built with some care. "The community housing initiative in the East End is doing really good work." "That's kind of you to say," Aldrich said. Won't you sit down? It wasn't quite a question. Vivienne's eyes flickered to his with something that might have been warning and might have been amusement, and in 3 years he had not noticed that her eyes were that particular shade, dark green, almost amber at the center, currently aimed at him with considerable precision. Jeffrey sat. Vivienne sat. Aldrich poured wine for both of them from the bottle he'd sent over, which had now migrated to his table through some logic none of them acknowledged. Vivienne tells me she works in finance, Jeffrey said. Vivienne, Aldrich said, is the reason Soane Capital functions. I don't think I've ever told her that adequately. He looked at her as he said it and watched something shift in her face, a small, involuntary softening that she covered quickly. You haven't, she said, and the dryness in her voice made Jeffrey laugh. She's funny, Jeffrey said to Aldrich, with the delighted air of a man sharing a discovery. I didn't expect. On her profile she seemed very professional, so I wasn't sure. Her profile, Aldrich repeated. Dating app, Jeffrey said cheerfully. That's how we met. She's got this great line in her bio, what is it? Fluent in spreadsheets and sarcasm. I thought this is someone worth meeting. Aldrich looked at Vivienne. She was looking at the tablecloth with an expression of profound neutrality. Fluent in spreadsheets and sarcasm, Aldrich said. It's just a bio, Vivienne said to the tablecloth. It's very accurate, he said. He was aware that he was doing something and was not entirely sure what it was. The wine was excellent. The restaurant was doing that thing expensive restaurants did, where the lighting made everyone look like they were in a film. Vivienne's hair was doing something complicated near her collarbone, and he was categorically not thinking about that. How long have you two been speaking? 3 weeks, Jeffrey said. Tonight's the first time in person, Vivienne added, and something about the way she said it, quick, slightly defensive, made Aldrich understand that she'd been nervous about tonight, that she'd dressed with care and arranged her hair and put on that particular shade of burgundy, because she was hoping something would come of this evening, and the realization sat in him like a stone dropping into still water. He had no right to the feeling that followed. He was clear on that. He took a drink of his wine and was very polite for the rest of dinner, which he was almost certain he was ruining anyway by simply being there. Jeffrey went to the restroom at some point. These things always have a moment, and this was it, and Vivienne turned to Aldrich with an expression he had never seen directed at him before. Quiet, level, like she'd decided something. Why eat here on Thursdays? You've never eaten here on a Thursday. You eat here on Tuesdays when you have the Marchetti meeting, and you use the private room. He looked at her. You track my schedule. I manage your schedule, she said. There's a difference. She let that sit for a moment. Aldrich, why are you here? He had several answers prepared. He didn't use any of them. What came out instead was quieter than he intended. I saw you through the window. Vivienne was still looking at him. You looked different, he said. I look the same. You just haven't been paying attention. It landed, as she must have known it would. He held her gaze and didn't deflect because she wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. In 3 years he had paid very close and very careful attention to her competence and almost no attention whatsoever to the fact that she was a woman who laughed at things and dressed with care and put a line about sarcasm in a dating profile because she wanted someone to think it was charming. He had, in effect, looked at his espresso machine and told it was reliable and gone back to his day. I'm paying attention now, he said. She searched his face for a moment. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. Or maybe she did, and it confused her. She looked away just as Jeffrey came back to the table, sliding into his chair with the easy manner of a man who had not walked into whatever had just happened at the table. It went wrong outside. These things always do. Aldrich had intended to say goodnight and leave them to it. He had made a decision in the restaurant, something quiet and uncomfortable and real, and he was going to honor it by walking to his car and letting Vivienne have her Thursday. He'd gotten as far as the entrance, coat over his arm, when he heard the sound of raised voices on the pavement. He was back through the door in 4 seconds. 2 men he recognized, peripherally from a meeting 6 months ago that had ended badly, and a debt that had not been repaid, were standing very close to Jeffrey on the pavement outside. Jeffrey, to his credit, was holding his ground, but he didn't know who these men were or what they were capable of, and Vivienne was standing very still beside him with the particular stillness of someone who absolutely knew exactly what was happening. Mr. Soane, she said, when she saw him come through the door, and the relief in her voice was small and careful, but it was there. One of the men, A heavyset figure named, as Aldrich recalled, Patrice, who worked collection for a rival operation out of Hamilton, turned and registered him with a look that moved quickly from contempt to something more cautious. "This is a private conversation," Patrice said. "The lady is my employee," Aldrich said pleasantly. "So I'm afraid it isn't." What followed was brief and not particularly pleasant, and Aldrich would not describe it in detail later. He had Finn and another man from the car by that point, and the situation resolved with the particular efficiency that came from one party understanding that the other party operated at a scale they had no interest in contesting. Patrice and his associate left. Geoffrey was shaken. Vivienne was not, which told Aldrich something important about what 3 years of working adjacent to his world had done to her sense of what counted as alarming. Geoffrey was kind about it, kinder than Aldrich would have been, probably. He checked on Vivienne twice, offered to call someone, suggested they reschedule for somewhere less eventful. He was a decent man. Aldrich could see it plainly, and it made him feel something he suspected was guilt, because decent men deserved fair competition, and what Aldrich Sohan had just done was the opposite of fair. Vivienne turned down the offer to reschedule. Her voice was gentle about it. Geoffrey looked at Aldrich once, with an expression that suggested he understood something about the situation that Aldrich himself was only just catching up with, and then he shook Vivienne's hand, a handshake, notably, not the hug of a man who felt the evening had gone anywhere, and he flagged a cab and he left. The rain had gotten serious. The pavement was shining. Vivienne stood with her jacket held closed against the cold and did not look at Aldrich. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "The situation would have resolved. Possibly. You're not going to apologize, are you? For which part?" She turned to look at him then. The restaurant light was falling out across the pavement, and her hair was getting damp at the edges, and she was looking at him the same way she'd looked at him inside. That recalculating look, like he was a set of numbers that weren't adding up to what she'd expected. "He was nice," she said. "He was. He would have been good company, probably." "You have no right," she said quietly, not accusing, just stating a thing they both understood. "I know that," he said. And then, because he had spent 3 years not paying the right kind of attention and he was very tired of it suddenly, he said, "I don't have the right. I know I don't. But I saw you through that window, Vivienne, and you were laughing, and I couldn't." He stopped, started again. "I've had you sitting 6 feet from my office for 3 years and I have never once made you laugh like that. That's on me. That's entirely on me. And I'm not proud of tonight, but I'm also not sorry I'm standing here." The rain was consistent now. Neither of them moved. "That's a very complicated thing to say to someone," she said. "I know. I'm your accountant. You're the person who knows where everything is buried, literally and figuratively, and you make everything function. And you've been in that office for 3 years being the best thing in it, and I have been very professionally stupid about it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You sent the poulet fumé. It's your favorite. You know my favorite wine." "I know your favorite wine," he said. "I know you take your coffee with a splash of oat milk and no sugar. I know you stay late on the last Tuesday of every month to reconcile the Cayman accounts because you don't trust anyone else to do it. I know when you're unhappy with a number, you chew the end of your pen, and when you've figured something out, you go very still before you start typing." He paused. "I have been paying attention. Just to the wrong things." The silence between them was different from the restaurant silence. That one had been careful. This one was full. "I live in Little Portugal," she said after a moment. "My car's in the shop. I was going to take the streetcar home." He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'll drive you," he said. "That's not Vivienne." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Fine," and turned to walk to his car, and he followed, and Finn had the sense to say absolutely nothing. The drive was 20 minutes. They spent some of it in quiet, which was a different kind of quiet than all the previous quiads of this evening. Less weight in it, like something had been set down that had been carried too long. Vivienne had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking out at the city going by, the streets shining and mostly empty. "I'm not going to pretend tonight didn't happen," she said at some point. "I wouldn't expect you to, and I'm not going to pretend I'm not, that there isn't." She stopped. The city slid past. "I'm organized," she said finally. "I have a very organized sense of what makes sense. And you don't make sense, Aldrich. You are a very complicated man with very complicated interests, and you operate in a world that has very real consequences. I know that better than most people." "You do," he agreed, "and you've never once You told me I was reliable. On my 2-year anniversary, you said I was reliable and consistent, like you were reviewing a filing system. The accuracy of this was, he found, genuinely painful. I know. Why now? She said. A man I met on an app asks me to dinner, and suddenly I exist. He had thought about this in the last 20 minutes, and he had an answer that was honest, if not flattering. Because I saw what you look like when someone is paying attention to you, he said. And I realized I was the one who hadn't been, and I didn't like what that said about me. She was quiet for a moment. That's very honest. I'm trying. It's also slightly infuriating. I know that too. She turned back to the window. They were in Little Portugal now. Old Victorian houses, lit porches, a bakery with its sign still on. She pointed at a building on a corner, and Finn pulled up. She didn't get out immediately. She sat for a moment with her hand on the door, and then she turned to him and said, "Come for a walk with me." He looked at her. "Not," she said, "just a walk. There's a park. It's not raining anymore." She glanced out the window. It was true. The rain had stopped somewhere in the last 10 minutes, and the street was just shining and still. "I want to talk to you," she said. "Not Aldrich Swain, not my employer. Just you for 20 minutes, if you can manage that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said to Finn, "Park around the corner. I'll call you." Finn nodded with the professional blankness of a man paid to be unreadable. The park was small, a Toronto neighborhood park, the kind with old trees and benches, and a path that went in a circle. They walked in the particular way of two people who are not quite sure what to do with their arms. She talked about Sudbury, where she'd grown up. He didn't know that. He knew she'd done her CPA in Toronto, but not where she was from. And she told him about growing up in a house that was loud and small and warm, about her mother who worked 2 jobs, about being the kid who did the family's taxes at 16, because she understood numbers the way other people understood people. She told him she'd moved to Toronto at 22 with a duffel bag and very good references and very few illusions, and that she'd taken to the job at Swain Capital because the money was right and the hours were clear, and she'd told herself it didn't matter what she was actually helping facilitate, as long as she stayed on the clean side of the ledger. "Do you?" he asked. "Stay on the clean side?" She looked at him. "You know I do. You've structured it that way on purpose. You keep me in the legitimate operations. I think you did that to protect yourself from liability. I've started to wonder lately if you also did it to protect me." He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "That's not nothing," she said quietly. They'd done the circuit of the park once and were partway through a second without discussing it. The trees dripped. A cat crossed the path ahead of them and went about its business. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "A normal. Whatever. I don't have that. I can't pretend to. I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm telling you the reality." "I know the reality," she said. "Aldrich, I've been doing your books for 3 years. I know what you are. I know what you've done." She paused. "I know you also paid 2 years of dialysis treatments for a woman in Scarborough whose son used to work for you and didn't tell anyone. I found it in the accounts. I've been sitting with that for 7 months." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said. "I find everything," she said. "That's what reliable means." They stopped at a bench without deciding to. Sat without discussing it. The neighborhood was quiet around them. The kind of quiet that cities get late on a Thursday when most people have gone home. "I'm not a good man," he said. "I know, but, she said, and turned to look at him. The light from a street lamp was doing something to her face that he was not going to think about analytically. She had her coat pulled closed, and her hair was half-dried, and she looked like herself. Not the cardigan version, not the burgundy dress version, just Vivienne, and that was the version he found he couldn't look away from. "You're not entirely what I thought you were either. And I've been very organized about not thinking about that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I want to take you to dinner," he said. "Properly. Somewhere I've chosen, on a day we've planned. Not like tonight." "Tonight was a disaster," she agreed. "It was," he said. "But I'm glad I went inside." She considered him. The cat reappeared from somewhere and sat down near their feet, with the philosophical air of a creature that had seen everything and was no longer surprised. "One dinner," she said, "and you behave. No bottles of wine sent to tables, no standing outside intimidating people. That was a coincidence. It was not a coincidence, and we both know it." But the corner of her mouth had moved, and it was the same corner he'd seen move across the restaurant, across the distance of a window, in the rain. He recognized it now. He intended to recognize it for a long time. "One dinner," he said, "and I'll behave." She stood up from the bench and straightened her coat and looked down at him with the expression of a woman who had just made a decision she would either never regret or never stop regretting, and hadn't yet determined which. "You still owe me an apology," she said. For the 2-year anniversary comment, he stood, "I know, a real one, not a business apology. I'm aware. And you're buying dinner?" "Obviously." She started walking back toward her building, and after a moment he fell into step beside her, and the city was quiet around them, and neither of them said anything more, and that quiet, that particular quiet, was the best thing that had happened to him in a very long time. He didn't tell her that, not yet, but he thought she already knew.